All right, so we have our basic form validation. We have our error function, show error, show success, and this stuff isn't changing, the show error and show success. Neither is this stuff. We need to bring in our DOM elements. But down here inside the event listener, I don't like how we just have a bunch of if statements. It's not very clean, and it's not very scalable. If we wanted to add more fields and add more validations, it's kind of messy. So I'm actually going to get rid of all these if statements in the event listener. So down to here. Because what I want to do is just have separate functions, like let's say check required, and we can run that on a field like username. All right, so we'll have a function, let's say check required fields, say function check required, and we could, have the input passed in. Now, we can do it this way, but we'll have to call check required on every field, like password, and so we'll basically have 4 different check requireds, and we're repeating ourselves, and we can make this better by, instead of passing in a single input, we can pass in an array of inputs that we want to be checked, that we want to be required. So instead of passing in just a variable or just the input, we'll pass in an array of all the inputs we want, which are all of them. Okay, so now we have an array getting passed in. So up here, instead of input, let's say input array. Now this does make it a little more difficult. What we have to do now is loop through the array and then do the check on each one. So to do that, I'm going to take the input array that's passed in, and we're going to use what's called a high order array method. And I actually have a project in this course that is based on explaining 5 of the most common ones, and for each is one of those. Okay, so we're going to do dot for each. So high order array methods are methods that you can attach to arrays to do different things. For each it simply loops through the array, and then you can do what you want within the loop. So we could just as well use a for loop, but this is much neater. So all the high order array methods, they take in a function. Oops. So they take in a function, and we want to pass in here an item which represents each input. Actually, we'll call it input. That makes more sense. And then what I'll do is just console log here input. Okay, so I'll save this, and once we submit, it's going to run the check required, pass in all these inputs as an array, loop through the array, and console log the inputs. So I'll submit, and you can see that it's just console logging all the inputs. All right, and we can get the value by doing dot value. Okay, so if I just type some stuff in here, and you can see, well, actually, would I type the same thing in? I didn't even mean to do that. Let's do A, B, C, and D, and you can see it logs A, B, C, D. So it's looping through all of these inputs and outputting the value. Now we want to do a check in here. We don't want to just log, and we're going to say if the input dot value, and I'm just going to add on trim to trim out any white space. So if that is equal to nothing, then we're going to show error, and we want to pass in whatever the input is, because remember, show error takes in the input, whether it's going to be username, email, password, password2, whatever the iteration is, it's going to pass it in, and then the message. And for now, I'm just going to say, we'll say cannot be, or we'll say is required. Oops. All right, and then we'll do an else and say show success and pass in the input. Okay, so let's save that, and now I'm going to click submit, and we get basically the same effect that we got before, except this is much cleaner. We're just simply calling check required and passing in an array. Now I want to figure out a way for us to say, username is required or email is required, and this input right here is just the actual element, so we can't use that. But this input element does have an ID property on it, which is going to give us whatever the ID is. So if we look at our inputs here, ID username, ID email, ID password, password 2. And we'll just show you this by console logging input.id. And if I submit, you can see I get all the IDs. So what I'll do is I'll use that here, and I could either concatenate it, but an easier way to do that is to use an ES6 template string. So we'll use backticks instead of quotes, and then we can put variables right in here, or expressions, by using a money sign and then curly braces. So I'll say input.id and then is required. So now if I submit, we get username is required, email is required. So it uses whatever is in the ID, which works for us, right? Now I do want to make the first letter uppercase. I mean, it's not a huge deal, but it's just something that I'd like to do. So I'm going to actually wrap this input ID into a function called, actually I'm not even the ID, I'm going to wrap the input in a function called get field name. So just make sure you wrap that correctly. Now this function I'm going to create, we'll create it down here. Whoop. So get field name, which is going to take in an input. Now from this I want to return the input ID, but I also want to uppercase the first letter. So let's return, so if I just return input ID like that, we're going to get the same effect we just got. So let's make this the first letter uppercase. Now there's a method called toUppercase. So if I do .to uppercase like that and we submit, you see that it makes the whole word uppercase. So in JavaScript, one of the solutions to capitalize the first letter is to cut out the first letter, make it uppercase, and then join the rest of the word. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to go input ID dot, and then there's a method called char at, so character at, and we can get a specific character, and we want the first one, which is 0. Okay, so it starts at 0. And just to show you what that gives us, if I submit, we get U, E, P. So this just gives us the first letter. And then we want to uppercase that. And if I save that, we submit, now we just get capital U, capital E, and so on. Now, obviously, we want the rest of the word. So what we can do is add to that. We'll just concatenate using a plus sign, and then input.id, which again will give us username, email, and so on, but we want to cut off the first letter now because we already have that coming here, uppercase. So to do that, we can use the slice method. And we want to go from the second character, and remember it's 0 base, so we want to start at 1. Okay, so basically we're just taking the first letter here, making it uppercase, and then we're adding the rest of the word without the first letter because we're starting at 1. 0 is the first letter. So let's save that, let's submit, and now you can see each one is uppercase. So as you can see, we're getting the same effect we got before, but instead of all those if statements, we're just running this function here, which is a lot cleaner. So in the next video, we're going to create some more functions to do some other checks. For instance, we want to check the length of certain fields. We want to check the email. We want to make sure the passwords match. So we're going to continue on with those in the next video.